The dust of rural Kansas settled on everything, a fine reddish-brown powder that coated the barracks, the fences, and the very souls of the women held within Camp Concordia. For Liesel Schmidt, a former signals operator with the Wehrmacht, the dust was a constant, gritty reminder of how far she was from the rain-washed forests of her homeland. The sky here was an endless, unforgiving blue, a stark contrast to the often gray canopy of Germany. It was a beautiful prison, but a prison nonetheless. The journey across the Atlantic had been a disorienting blur of rocking ships, crowded holds, and the constant, unnerving chatter of a language she barely understood. Now, in the heart of America, the disorientation had sharpened into a daily reality. The camp was a collection of simple wooden buildings, arranged in neat, orderly rows, all enclosed by the ubiquitous barbed wire that glinted under the powerful American sun. It was clean, it was organized, and it was utterly devoid of hope. Liesel was not like many of the other women. While some wept openly, their grief a raw and public spectacle, and others hardened into bitter shells of their former selves, Liesel cultivated a quiet resilience. She was 24 years old, though the war had etched lines of a much older woman around her eyes. Her blonde hair, once a source of pride, was now cut short for practicality, and her blue eyes, which had once sparkled with youthful optimism, now held a steady, watchful gaze. She had seen too much, lost too much, to indulge in the luxury of despair. Her parents were gone, lost in the firebombing of Dresden. Her younger brother, just a boy of 17, had been conscripted in the final desperate months of the war and had vanished on the Eastern Front. All she had left was her dignity, and she clung to it with a fierce tenacity. Her strength was often mistaken for arrogance by the American guards. They saw a young woman who did not bow her head, who met their gaze directly, and they interpreted it as defiance. The camp commander, a portly man named Captain Miller, had a habit of puffing out his chest whenever he addressed the prisoners, as if his physical size could somehow diminish their spirit. He saw them not as soldiers, but as curiosities, fallen women from a defeated nation. His deputy, Sergeant Donahue, was worse. Donahue was a man who clearly enjoyed his authority. He had a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face, and his words were often laced with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Look at them." "Captain," Donahue had said one morning, loud enough for Liesel and the other women in the yard to hear, playing house in their little prison. "You'd think they were on holiday." Liesel's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She was mending a torn shirt for another prisoner, a young woman named Elke who seemed to be shrinking with each passing day. Elke's eyes were wide with fear, and she flinched at Donahue's words. Liesel placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Pay him no mind," she whispered in German. "His words are like the wind here, full of dust and noise, but ultimately powerless." Elke managed a weak smile, but the fear remained. It was a constant companion for all of them. The uncertainty of their future was a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate them. They were fed, they were clothed, and they were not mistreated in the physical sense. But they were prisoners, thousands of miles from the ruins of their homes, with no word of their families, no idea when or if they would ever return. The daily routine was monotonous. Wake up at dawn, roll call, breakfast of porridge and coffee that tasted more like bitter water. Then work details. Some women were assigned to the laundry, others to the kitchens or the infirmary. Liesel, with her background in communications, was initially put to work sorting mail, a task she performed with meticulous efficiency. But Donahue, ever watchful, seemed to resent her competence. "Think you're clever, don't you?" he'd said one afternoon, snatching a bundle of letters from her hands. "All you Krauts think you're so smart. Look where it got you." Liesel said nothing, her silence a shield against his taunts. She simply waited for him to finish his inspection, his grubby fingers smudging the ink on the envelopes. He found nothing out of place, of course, and with a grunt of frustration, he shoved the letters back at her and stalked away. After that, she was reassigned to the vegetable garden, a patch of dusty earth where the women coaxed stubborn rows of potatoes and beans from the unforgiving soil. It was hard, back-breaking work under the relentless Kansas sun. The women's hands became calloused, their backs ached, and the sun beat down on their heads. But for Liesel, there was a strange solace in the repetitive motion of tilling the soil, of planting seeds, of pulling weeds. It was honest work, and in the evenings, when she collapsed onto her narrow cot, the physical exhaustion helped to keep the darker thoughts at bay. She formed a small circle of friends in the garden. There was Greta, a stout, middle-aged woman who had been a nurse in Berlin. Greta had a pragmatic, no-nonsense attitude and a surprisingly bawdy sense of humor that often brought a much-needed moment of levity to their bleak existence. There was also Anya, a quiet, artistic young woman who had been a student before the war. Anya would often sketch in the dirt with a stick during their brief rest periods, creating fleeting images of flowers and birds and faces from a life that seemed a world away. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the flat horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the women were gathered in the common area. The air was thick with the low murmur of conversations, the clinking of spoons against tin bowls as they ate their meager supper of stew and hard bread. Suddenly, the door to the barracks swung open and Sergeant Donahue stood there, a smug look on his face. "All right, ladies," he announced, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "Your benevolent Uncle Sam has decided you could all use a little entertainment, a little taste of the good life." The women exchanged confused glances. What could he possibly mean? "Tomorrow night," Donahue continued, "we're going to take you to the movies. A real American picture show." A ripple of astonishment went through the room. The movies? It seemed absurd, a fantastical notion in their current circumstances. For most of them, the last time they had seen a film was in a grand, ornate theater in a city that might not even exist anymore. The idea of sitting in a dark room watching a story unfold on a screen felt like a dream from another lifetime. "Don't get too excited," Donahue sneered, clearly enjoying their reaction. "It's not a social outing. You'll be under guard, of course. And any funny business, any at all, and you'll regret it. Understand?" He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Liesel for a moment. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression unreadable. He seemed disappointed by her lack of a visible reaction, and with a final, contemptuous sniff, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The room erupted in a cacophony of whispers. "The movies!" For some, it was a spark of excitement, a break from the soul-crushing monotony. For others, it was a source of anxiety. What did the Americans want from them? Was this some kind of trick? "What do you think, Liesel?" Greta asked, her brow furrowed in thought. "Is it a trap?" Liesel slowly finished her bread, chewing with deliberate slowness. "I don't think it's a trap," she said finally. "I think it's something else. I think they want to show off. They want to show us what we've lost, what they have. They want to rub our noses in their victory." Anja, who had been listening quietly, shivered. "That's a cruel thought." "It is," Liesel agreed. "But have they shown us anything but cruelty? A different kind, perhaps. Not the cruelty of the battlefield, but the slow, grinding cruelty of humiliation." Greta sighed, her shoulders slumping. "You're probably right. Still," she added, a flicker of her usual spirit returning, "it might be nice to sit in a comfortable chair for a few hours. My back feels like it's 100 years old." The next day, the anticipation in the camp was palpable. The women went about their duties with a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. They tried to make themselves look presentable, washing their faces with extra care, smoothing out the wrinkles in their drab, uniform-like dresses. It was a small act of defiance, a way of asserting their humanity in a place that was designed to strip it away. As evening approached, they were herded into the back of several large military trucks. The canvas flaps were down, blocking their view, and the journey was bumpy and uncomfortable. They clung to the wooden benches, the jolting of the truck a physical manifestation of their own unease. When the trucks finally came to a stop, the flaps were thrown open, and they were blinded by a blaze of colored lights. They were in a small town, a place that seemed impossibly vibrant and alive compared to the desolate landscape of the camp. The street was lined with shops, their windows filled with goods that seemed impossibly luxurious. And then they saw it, the theater. It was called the Majestic, and its name was spelled out in bright, glowing neon letters. A large, colorful poster advertised the film Meet Me in St. Louis, starring a smiling woman with bright red lipstick. The townspeople, what few were on the street at that hour, stopped and stared. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Whispers followed the women as they were marched, 2 by 2, from the trucks to the theater entrance. "Look, the German prisoners," someone hissed. "What are they doing here?" The movie night, intended as a demonstration of American superiority, had an unintended effect on the women of Camp Concordia. Instead of crushing their spirits, it ignited a spark. The brief glimpse into a world of vibrant color, carefree living, and endless abundance served as a stark, painful reminder of all they had lost, but it also, paradoxically, strengthened their resolve. It was a shared experience, a collective memory that bonded them in a way their shared suffering had not. They spoke of it in hushed tones in the laundry, in the garden, in the quiet moments before sleep. They marveled at the actress's perfect teeth, the impossibly clean streets, the sheer amount of food on the tables in the film. And they talked about the popcorn. "It was like eating a sweet, salty cloud," Anya said, her artist's eyes dreamy with the memory. "I never imagined such a thing existed." "It's just corn, puffed up with hot air," Greta said, ever the pragmatist. "Much like the Americans themselves." Liesel smiled at that. Greta's sharp tongue was a comfort. But Liesel saw it differently. The popcorn, the movie, the entire bizarre spectacle was more than just a psychological tactic. It was a crack in the wall of their isolation. It showed them that a world still existed outside the barbed wire, a world that was moving on without them. The thought was both terrifying and galvanizing. They could not simply wait for their fate to be decided. They had to endure, and to do that, they had to hold on to their sense of self. This newfound, unspoken resolve did not go unnoticed by Sergeant Donahue. He seemed to sense a shift in the prisoners' demeanor, a subtle straightening of their backs, a less submissive quality in their eyes, and it infuriated him. He had expected the movie to make them more pliable, more aware of their lowly position. Instead, they seemed stronger. He singled out Liesel as the source of this quiet defiance. Her refusal to be cowed, her unwavering composure, was a personal affront to his authority. He began to watch her constantly, looking for any excuse to punish her, to break her. The garden became his new theater of operations. He would stand at the edge of the patch, arms crossed over his chest, his shadow falling over the rows of struggling plants. He would criticize their work, kicking at a loose clod of dirt here, pointing out a missed weed there. "You call that a straight line, Schmidt?" He'd bark, pointing at a row of potato plants. "My grandmother could plow a straighter furrow, and she's been dead for 10 years. Liesel would simply pick up her hoe and straighten the line, her movements economical and precise, her face a mask of detached indifference. Her refusal to react only fueled his anger. He started implementing new, petty rules. Water breaks were shortened. The women were forbidden from speaking to each other in German while they worked. He claimed it was a security measure, that they could be plotting an escape. In reality, it was an act of cultural warfare, an attempt to strip them of their identity, one word at a time. This was a blow to all the women, but especially to the older ones who knew little to no English. Conversation became a stilted, frustrating affair of gestures and broken phrases. The easy camaraderie of the garden was replaced by a tense, enforced silence. The women worked with their heads down, the silence broken only by the chop of the hose and Donahue's occasional, grating commentary. One sweltering afternoon, the Kansas sun was at its peak, beating down with a merciless intensity. The air was thick and still, and the heat radiated off the dry earth in shimmering waves. Elka, the young woman Liesel had comforted before, was looking particularly pale. She had been quiet and withdrawn ever since the movie night, the vibrant fantasy on screen seeming to have drained the last of her own color. She moved slowly, her hoe rising and falling with a listless rhythm. Liesel watched her with growing concern. "Elka, you should rest in the shade for a moment," she murmured in English, keeping her voice low. Elka shook her head. "I am fine," she whispered, but a moment later, her knees buckled and she swayed on her feet. Liesel dropped her tool and rushed to her side, catching her just as she began to fall. "She needs water." Liesl said, looking directly at Donahue, who was watching the scene with a detached curiosity. She has heat stroke. She's faking, Donahue said with a sneer. Get her back to work. She is not faking, Liesl insisted, her voice firm but respectful. Look at her. She's barely conscious. We need to get her to the infirmary. The other women had stopped working now, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. This was a line being drawn in the dust. I give the orders here, Schmidt, Donahue said, taking a step closer. His face was red with anger and the heat. And I say she's fine. Now, get back to your row before I put you in solitary for insubordination. Liesl looked down at Elke, whose breathing was shallow and rapid. Her skin was clammy to the touch. Then she looked back up at Donahue. In that moment, something inside her snapped. It was not a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, decisive click. She had endured his taunts, his pettiness, his casual cruelty. But she would not stand by and watch a young, vulnerable woman suffer because of his callous pride. No, she said, her voice quiet but clear, ringing with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. Donahue's eyes widened in disbelief. What did you say? I said no, Liesl repeated, her gaze unwavering. I will not get back to work. I am taking her to the infirmary. You can do what you want with me afterwards. Without waiting for his response, she carefully hoisted Elke into her arms. Elke was light, frighteningly so, like a bird with broken wings. With the other women staring in stunned silence, Liesl began to walk towards the gate of the garden, her steps steady and determined. For a moment, Donahue was too shocked to move. A prisoner had defied a direct order. In his world, this was unthinkable, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. Guards, he roared. Stop her! Two young guards, barely out of their teens, moved to block Liesl's path, their rifles held uncertainly. They looked from Donahue's furious face to Liesl's determined one, and for a moment they hesitated. There was no menace in Liesl's posture, only a fierce protective resolve. Step aside, Liesl said to them, her voice calm. This woman is sick. You heard the sergeant, one of the guards mumbled, looking uncomfortable. You have to go back. And you heard me, she replied, never breaking her stride. She needs a doctor. Are you going to stop me? She walked directly towards them, and at the last second they faltered, stepping aside to let her pass. She had called their bluff. They were soldiers, but they were also young men who had likely been raised to respect women, to help those in need. And the sight of Liesl carrying the limp form of her friend was a far more powerful image than Donahue's blustering orders. Liesl walked out of the garden and across the dusty compound, heading straight for the infirmary. She could feel Donahue's eyes boring into her back, but she did not look back. She had won the confrontation, but she knew she would pay a price for it. The camp doctor, a weary but kind man named Major Thompson, took one look at Elke and immediately started barking orders at the nurses. Dehydration, severe heat exhaustion, he muttered, shaking his head. Another few minutes out there and she could have had a seizure. He looked at Liesl, his eyes full of a new respect. You did the right thing, bringing her in. Liesl simply nodded, her adrenaline starting to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She waited until she was sure Elke was being cared for before she turned to leave. As she stepped out of the infirmary, she was met by Donahue and two military policemen. Liesl Schmidt, Donahue said, his voice cold and clipped, savoring the moment. You are under arrest for gross insubordination and inciting a disruption. You're going to solitary? Liesl had expected it. She offered no resistance as the MPs took her arms and led her away. She walked with her head held high, ignoring the whispers and stares of the other prisoners who had gathered to watch. As she passed the vegetable garden, she saw Greta and Anya standing by the fence, their faces etched with worry. Greta gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. It was enough. The solitary confinement cell was a small, windowless box with a concrete floor, a thin mattress, and a bucket in the corner. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind her, plunging her into a thick, suffocating darkness. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the barracks. For the first few hours, She simply stood in the center of the cell, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. There was a small slit in the door, and a tiny sliver of light from the corridor outside was the only illumination. Days blurred into one another. Twice a day, the slit in the door would open, and a tray with a piece of bread and a cup of water would be slid inside. The darkness and the silence were a form of torture designed to break the spirit, to make one feel utterly alone and forgotten. But Donahue had once again underestimated Liesel. She was no stranger to hardship, to isolation. She had spent countless hours alone in her signals outpost, listening to the crackle of static, the distant rumble of artillery, her only companion. She had learned to retreat into the fortress of her own mind. She paced the small cell, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. She recited poetry she had memorized as a schoolgirl. She sang old folk songs under her breath. She thought about her family, not with the sharp, stabbing grief of the early days, but with a quiet. Working in the infirmary was like entering a different world. It was a quiet, orderly space that smelled of antiseptic and clean linens, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat of the garden or the noisy, crowded barracks. Major Thompson was a man of few words, but he was a dedicated doctor who treated his patients, American and German alike, with the same gruff but gentle care. He quickly recognized Liesel's intelligence and steady hands, and soon she was doing more than just changing sheets and mopping floors. He taught her how to dress wounds, how to take a patient's temperature and blood pressure, how to recognize the signs of the various ailments that swept through the camp. Liesel found a deep sense of purpose in the work. Tending to the sick and injured, offering a cool cloth to a fevered brow or a quiet word of comfort to a homesick girl felt meaningful. It was a way to push back against the destruction and despair of the war, to affirm life in a place that was defined by loss. Her German was a comfort to the prisoners, and her growing command of English allowed her to act as a bridge between the patients and the American medical staff. She became a trusted figure, a source of stability in the chaotic world of the camp. Her new role did not go unnoticed. The other women looked up to her, seeking her advice not just on medical matters, but on all sorts of problems. Captain Miller treated her with a newfound respect, often stopping by the infirmary to ask for her assessment of the prisoners' health and morale. The departure of Sergeant Donahue had lifted a cloud from the camp. His replacement was a young professional sergeant who treated the women with a detached but correct courtesy. The atmosphere was still that of a prison, but the daily, grinding humiliation was gone. Yet, even as her own circumstances improved, Liesel was keenly aware of the deep well of sadness that still existed among the prisoners. The most painful affliction, and the one Major Thompson could not heal, was the lack of news from home. Mail was sporadic and heavily censored. Letters, when they finally arrived, were often months old, telling of events that had long since been overtaken by the chaos of the war's end. For most, there was only silence, a vast, terrifying silence from across the ocean that left them to imagine the worst. This silence was particularly hard on the women with children. They would clutch worn photographs of their little ones, their eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. They wondered if their children were safe, if they were hungry, if they even remembered their mothers' faces. One day, a new group of prisoners arrived at the camp. Among them was a woman named Magda. She was gaunt and hollow-eyed, and she carried a small, threadbare teddy bear, clutching it to her chest as if it were a life raft. She spoke to no one, and her eyes were filled with a vacant, haunted look. The other women from her transport said that her home in Hamburg had been destroyed in a bombing raid, and she had been separated from her 5-year-old son during the chaos. She had no idea if he was alive or dead. Magda was assigned to Liesel's barracks, and Liesel tried to reach out to her, offering her extra food from the infirmary, trying to engage her in conversation. But Magda remained lost in her own private world of grief. She would spend hours sitting on her cot, rocking back and forth, whispering a name over and over again. Lucas. Lucas. Liesel's heart ached for her. She saw in Magda the embodiment of all their collective pain. She knew that something had to be done, not just for Magda, but for all of them. They needed more than just food and shelter. They needed hope. An idea began to form in Liesel's mind, a bold and audacious plan. She knew the risks, but the potential reward was too great to ignore. She requested a meeting with Captain Miller. He received her in his office, a neat, sparse room with a large American flag hanging on the wall. He motioned for her to sit, a gesture of respect he would not have afforded her a few months ago. "What can I do for you, Miss Schmidt?" he asked. Liesel took a deep breath. "Captain," she began, her voice steady, "I am here to talk to you about the morale of the prisoners. The women are suffering, not from a lack of food or from mistreatment. They are suffering from a lack of information. The silence from home, it is destroying them." Miller sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I understand that," he said. "But there's not much I can do. The mail system is a mess. The Red Cross is overwhelmed. We are doing the best we can." "I believe there is something that can be done," Liesel said, leaning forward. "Something that you could do. In the infirmary, we have a shortwave radio. Major Thompson uses it to listen to medical broadcasts." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "That radio is for official use only. Access is strictly forbidden to prisoners." "I know," Liesel said. "But the radio can pick up broadcasts from all over the world, including the BBC German service. The British Broadcasting Corporation had a program that was well known throughout Germany. It was called the German Wehrmacht Report, but after the surrender, it had been repurposed by the Allies. It now broadcast messages from civilians trying to find their lost loved ones who were soldiers or prisoners of war. People would send in messages, and the announcers would read them on the air in the hope that someone, somewhere, might hear them. Miller understood immediately what she was asking. "You want to listen to the enemy's propaganda network?" he asked, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. "It is not propaganda anymore, Captain," Liesel corrected him gently. "It is a lifeline. It is a way for families to find each other, to hear a name, a message. It could be the difference between hope and despair. For a woman like Magda, who has lost everything, it could be the one thing that brings her back." Miller was silent for a long time, steepling his fingers under his chin. What Liesel was proposing was a significant breach of protocol. Allowing prisoners access to foreign radio broadcasts was strictly against the rules. If his superiors found out, he could be severely reprimanded. But he thought of the women's faces, the deep, weary sadness in their eyes. He thought of his own wife and children, safe at home, and felt a pang of empathy. He had come to see these women not as the enemy, but as victims of a war they did not start. "This would have to be done in secret," he said finally, his voice low. "No one can know. Just you, me, and Major Thompson. If anyone finds out—" "They won't," Liesel promised, her heart leaping with a mixture of excitement and relief. "I will be the only one who listens. I will be discreet. Thank you, Captain. You will not regret this." That night, after the infirmary was quiet and the patients were asleep, Liesel sat in Major Thompson's small office, her heart pounding. The major, who had been briefed by Captain Miller, showed her how to operate the shortwave radio. "Be careful," he warned. "The signal can be tricky. And don't let anyone see you." He left her alone, and she put on the headphones, the crackle of static filling her ears. She slowly turned the dial, the needle sliding across a landscape of foreign-sounding cities, Moscow, Paris, Rome. And then she found it. A faint signal, a voice speaking in crisp, clear German. "It was the BBC, and a final message tonight," the announcer was saying, "from a Frau Helga Fischer in Munich. She is looking for her husband, Sergeant Klaus Fischer, last known to be serving with the 2nd Panzer Division. Helga says, 'Klaus, my love, the children and I are safe. We are waiting for you. Please come home.'" Tears pricked at Liesel's eyes. The simple, heartfelt message, broadcast across thousands of miles of ocean and land, was a powerful testament to the enduring bonds of love and family. She listened for an hour, scribbling down names and messages in a small notebook she had hidden. The names were a roll call of the lost and the missing, a litany of a nation's grief. But within the sadness there were glimmers of hope. A son found alive in a hospital. A wife who had made it safely to the American zone. A father letting his children know he was a prisoner, but he was well. The next day, Liesel began her secret mission. During her rounds in the barracks, she would casually mention a name she had heard. "Annalise," she might say to a woman from Hamburg, "I had a dream last night about a man named Franz Richter from your city. Do you know of him?" The woman's eyes would widen. "That is my brother's name!" "The dream was very clear," Liesel would continue, her voice soft. "He is alive. He is in a camp in England, and he is looking for you. It was a small deception, but a necessary one." She could not reveal the source of her information. But the impact of her dreams was immediate and profound. A woman who had been listless with worry would suddenly be filled with a renewed energy. A mother who had been weeping for her son would start to smile again. Hope, more powerful than any medicine, began to spread through the camp. Liesel became known as the Dreamer. The women would seek her out, asking if she had dreamed of their husbands, their brothers, their sons. Liesel was careful. She never gave false hope. She only shared the names and messages she had actually heard on the broadcast. For many, there was still only silence. But even for them, the fact that others were finding their loved ones was a reason to keep believing. She listened every night, the crackle of the radio her secret companion. It was emotionally draining work. For every happy message of reunion, there were a dozen desperate pleas that went unanswered. She carried the weight of all their stories, all their hopes and fears. The day of Magda's departure was a momentous occasion at Camp Concordia. The women who had so little to give showered her with small handmade gifts, a knitted scarf, a carefully sketched portrait of her son based on her descriptions, a pouch of dried herbs from the garden to make tea. They gathered at the main gate to see her off, their faces a mixture of sadness at her leaving and overwhelming joy for her good fortune. Magda, a transformed woman, her eyes bright with purpose, hugged each of them, promising to write, promising to look for their families when she got back to Germany. Her final embrace was for Liesel. "I have no words," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You gave me back my life. How can I ever repay you?" "There is nothing to repay," Liesel said, squeezing her hand. "Just hold your son tight. That will be payment enough for all of us." As the truck carrying Magda rolled away, kicking up a cloud of reddish-brown dust, a profound sense of hope settled over the women who remained. Magda's story was their story. It was proof that miracles could happen, that families could be reunited, that the war had not destroyed everything. Liesel, watching the truck disappear over the horizon, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her risky plan had worked beyond her wildest dreams, but her work was not done. She continued her nightly vigils at the radio, a secret keeper of hopes and fears. The list of names in her notebook grew, a testament to the shattered landscape of post-war Europe. Each name was a story, each message a prayer sent out into the ether. A few months passed. The harsh Kansas summer mellowed into a golden autumn. The work in the infirmary continued, and Liesel's reputation as a compassionate and capable caregiver grew. She had found a rhythm to her life in the camp, a sense of purpose that made the days bearable. But she never stopped dreaming of home, never stopped wondering about the fate of her own family. She had heard nothing, not a single word, since the last letter from her mother, written just days before the firebombing of Dresden. In her heart, she knew they were gone, but a small, stubborn part of her refused to let go of the slimmest sliver of hope. One evening, a high-ranking officer arrived at the camp for an inspection. He was a stern, imposing man, a brigadier general from Washington, D.C. His name was General Davies, and he was in charge of prisoner-of-war affairs. Captain Miller was visibly nervous as he escorted the general around the camp, showing him the barracks, the kitchens, the well-tended gardens. When they reached the infirmary, Major Thompson greeted them and gave a tour of the clean, orderly facility. The general seemed impressed. As they were about to leave, his eyes fell upon Liesel, who was quietly changing a bandage for a young prisoner with a sprained ankle. "And who is this?" General Davies asked. "This is Liesel Schmidt, sir," Captain Miller said. "She's one of the prisoners. She serves as an assistant and translator for Major Thompson. She's been an invaluable asset." The general looked at Liesel, his eyes sharp and appraising. "Schmidt? he repeated, a strange expression on his face. From where in Germany? From Dresden, sir, Liesl replied, her voice steady, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. General Davies stared at her, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. Liesl Schmidt from Dresden, he said again, almost to himself. He seemed to be searching his memory. Tell me, he said, his voice suddenly intense, did you have a brother? Liesl was taken aback by the personal question. Yes, sir, she said, her voice barely a whisper. His name was Karl. He was 17. The general's stern demeanor seemed to crack. A look of astonishment, of dawning recognition spread across his face. My God, he breathed. It is you. Captain Miller and Major Thompson exchanged confused glances. Liesl simply stared at the general, her mind racing. How could this high-ranking American officer possibly know her or her brother? General Davies seemed to pull himself together. Captain Miller, he said, his voice now formal and commanding, I need to speak with Miss Schmidt privately. In your office. Now. Mystified, Captain Miller led them back to his office. Once the door was closed, General Davies turned to Liesl. His eyes were no longer those of a stern officer, but of a man who was looking at a ghost. I was an intelligence officer during the war, he began, his voice low and serious, stationed in Switzerland. My job was to gather information from within Germany. A few months before the end of the war, we were contacted by a new informant, a young man working in the Signals Command in Berlin. He was just a boy, but he was brave, and he was horrified by what the Nazi regime was doing. He started passing us information, vital information, troop movements, supply line weaknesses, information that saved thousands of American lives. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This young man used a code name. He called himself the Nightingale. We never knew his real name. It was too dangerous. All we knew was that he was doing it because he wanted to shorten the war and that he had an older sister he loved very much. He told us her name was Liesl. Liesl felt the room begin to spin. She gripped the edge of the desk for support. Karl, her quiet, bookish little brother, a hero. It seemed impossible. In the final days of the war, the general continued, his voice thick with emotion, we lost contact with him. We knew the Gestapo was closing in. We tried to get him out, but it was too late. The last message he ever sent us was not about troop movements. It was personal. He said, if I do not make it, find my sister. Her name is Liesl Schmidt, from Dresden. Tell her I did what I thought was right. Tell her I love her. Tears were streaming down Liesl's face now, silent and hot. She was not just crying for the loss of her brother, but for the astonishing revelation of his secret life, his incredible courage. The little boy she had protected and teased had been a man of extraordinary bravery. General Davies handed her a handkerchief. We tried to find you after the war, he said gently. But Dresden was in the Soviet zone. Records were destroyed, everything was in chaos. We assumed you had been lost in the bombing, along with your parents. It was only when Captain Miller mentioned your name. I never imagined we would find you here, in a POW camp in Kansas. He cleared his throat, his professional demeanor returning, but his eyes were still full of a deep, profound respect. Liesl Schmidt, you are not a prisoner of war. You are the sister of a hero who served the Allied cause at great personal risk. Your detention here has been a grave mistake. The news of Liesl's true identity sent shockwaves through the camp. She was no longer just the dreamer, the quiet caregiver. She was the sister of a war hero, a woman who had been wrongly imprisoned. The American staff looked at her with a new, undisguised awe. The story of her brother, the Nightingale, became a legend whispered in the barracks. General Davies made arrangements for her immediate release. A car was to come for her the next day to take her to Washington, where she would be given new papers and the chance to start a new life in America, if she chose. Her last night in the camp was bittersweet. The women threw her a farewell party, sharing their meager rations to create a small feast. They sang songs, not the sad, homesick melodies of their early days, but songs of hope and resilience. Greta, her pragmatic friend, hugged her tightly. Don't forget us, Liesl, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Never, Liesl promised, her heart aching at the thought of leaving them. These women, who had been strangers, had become her family. The next morning, as she stood at the gate waiting for her car, Captain Miller approached her. He held out his hand. "It has been an honor, Miss Schmidt," he said. Liesel shook his hand. "Thank you, Captain." "For everything. For your kindness." "You earned it," he replied. "You taught us all a lesson. You showed us that courage and dignity are not defined by the uniform one wears." As the black car pulled away from Camp Concordia, Liesel looked back one last time at the familiar wooden barracks and the barbed wire fences that had been her world for so long. She saw the women waving, their faces full of hope. Her journey had been one of unimaginable loss and hardship. She had been insulted, mocked, and underestimated. But she had never lost her sense of self. She had endured, she had sacrificed, and in the most unlikely of places, she had found a strange and unexpected form of justice. The story of the German woman POW who amazed everyone with her quiet strength became a part of the camp's history. And long after the last prisoner had gone home, the locals in the small Kansas town would sometimes talk about the night they took the German women to the movies. They would remember their stunned faces, their quiet tears, and their utter amazement at the simple, magical pleasure of popcorn. It was a small, peculiar footnote in the grand, terrible history of the war, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are moments of unexpected wonder, and that the human spirit, like a stubborn flower in the dusty Kansas soil, will always find a way to endure and to bloom. Liesel Schmidt, the sister of the Nightingale, was living proof of that.